Lincoln had 4 months until his inauguration. During this time, President James Buchanan was undermining Lincoln. During the campaign, Douglas had warned the people if there was a Republican victory, there would be a war of sections, a war of the North against the South, of the free slaves against the slave states, a war of extermination. The period of 4 months between the election and inauguration could not be devoted to rest or long-term goal planning for his administration. There developed a plan for the disruption of the government. Lincoln had no power. He could only watch the two factions of the country begin to posture themselves for a war. Buchanan, who was then president, was a Northern man with Southern principles, and some believed this clouded his vantage point for his understanding. He became easily manipulated by those who were attempting to destroy the Union. Jefferson Davis, though not a member of Buchanan's cabinet, was probably the most influential of the Southerners in Washington. He had been Secretary of War under Pierce, and it was he who inaugurated the policy of stripping the North for the purpose of strengthening the military defenses of the South. President Buchanan, in his annual message to Congress on December 3, 1860, discussed the subject of slavery. He recommended that it be extended to the territories, the very thing that the people had just voted should not be done. Concerning secession, he said that the government had the power to suppress revolt, but that it could not use that power in reference to South Carolina, the state under consideration. The secessionists had apparently tied the hands of the president. The president's cabinet was coming apart at the seams. Lewis Cass, Secretary of State, reigned over a dispute involving the president's actions when he failed to suppress problems in Charleston Harbor. Howell Cobb, Secretary of the Treasury, had gone through all the funds in the Treasury and destroyed the line of credit for the government. John B. Floyd, Secretary of War, carried out the plan which Jefferson Davis had begun to operate several years before. The Northern arsenals were stripped of the arms and ammunition which were sent to the South for storage or use. Congress had its own problems. Both Senate and House raised committees for the purpose of devising means of compromise. But every measure of concession was promptly voted down by the body that had appointed the committees. In the Senate, the slave party was in full control. In the House, the slave party was not in majority, but they enjoyed this advantage, that they were able to work together while the constituency of the free states were usually divided among themselves. And in joint session, the extreme pro-slavery men were always able to prevent anything from being accomplished. On December 14th, 30 of the Southern senators and representatives had issued a circular to their constituents. They said that the argument was exhausted, that all hope of a compromise was extinguished, and that the honor, safety, and independence of the Southern people required the organization of a Southern Confederacy. South Carolina was the first to act. 6 days later, that state passed the Ordinance of Secession. By the 1st of February, 7 states had passed Ordinance of Secession. It was hard to imagine a more severe test than this imposed on Lincoln during this period of waiting. He made his preparations in silence. He left his home in Springfield for Washington on February 11th. Although he made several speeches along the way, he did not outline his policy until he read his inaugural address on the 4th of March. Lincoln arrived in Washington on February 23, 1861. Every official courtesy was shown to the president-elect. He had many supporters in both houses of Congress. Both Douglas and Breckinridge called on him to show their support. Shortly after 12 o'clock noon on March 4, 1861, Buchanan called to escort Lincoln to the Capitol. Lincoln was introduced to the crowd by his former neighbor, E.D. Baker, the senator from Oregon. In one hand, Lincoln had his silk hat, and as he looked for a place to put it, Douglas took the hat and said, "If I can't be president, I can at least hold the president's hat." These two passages from Lincoln's inaugural speech reflected the troubles of the time. "I shall take care, as the Constitution itself expressly enjoins upon me, that the laws of the Union shall be faithfully executed in all the states. Doing this, which I deem to be only a simple duty on my part, I shall perfectly perform it, so far as it is practicable, unless my rightful masters, the American people, shall withhold the requisition, or in some authoritative manner direct the contrary. I trust this will not be regarded as a menace, but only as a declared purpose of the Union, that it will constitutionally defend and maintain itself. In doing this, there need be no bloodshed or violence, and there shall be none unless it is forced upon the national authority. The power confided in me will be used to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government, and collect the duties and imposts. But beyond what may be necessary for these objects, there will be no invasion, no using of force against or among the people anywhere. In all the thousands of people there assembled, there was none who listened more intently than Stephen A. Douglas. At the conclusion of Lincoln's speech, Douglas shook his hand and committed himself to the administration. Unfortunately, he died in Chicago on the 3rd of June, 1861. The selection of a cabinet was a difficult and delicate task. Lincoln was confronted by a solid South and backed by a divided North. In the 15 Southern states, he received not a single electoral vote, and in 10 of these, not a single popular vote. Lincoln put a great deal of careful thought into his selections. Herndon recalled Mrs. Lincoln saying,
"My husband places great reliance on my knowledge of human nature, often telling me when about to make some important appointment that he has no knowledge of men and their motives."
William Seward, his most vocal opponent during the election, was named Secretary of State, and Solomon Chase, another abolitionist, was named Secretary of the Treasury. Seward felt that he would be able to dominate Lincoln. He wrote Lincoln a letter on April 1st, 1861, detailing his thoughts for the President's consideration. Seward told the President, "Mr. Lincoln, you are a failure as President, but turn over the direction of affairs exclusively to me, and all shall be well and will be forgiven." For obvious reasons, Lincoln disagreed. Lincoln's reply suggested that his cabinet would be involved in the decision-making and responded to Seward by stating, "Upon your closing propositions, that whatever policy we adopt, there must be an energetic prosecution of it. For this purpose, it must be somebody's business to pursue and direct it incessantly. Either the President must do it himself and be all the while active in it, or devolve it on some member of his cabinet. Once adopted, debates on it must end and all agree and abide. I remark that if this must be done, I must do it. When a general line of policy is adopted, I apprehend there is no danger of it being changed without good reason or continuing to be a subject of unnecessary debate. Still, upon points arising in its progress, I wish, and suppose, I am entitled to have the advice of the Cabinet." Seward was won over. The letters were never discussed, and Seward remained loyal to Lincoln throughout his term in office. The events connected with the fall of Fort Sumter were so dramatic that the name is connected with the starting of the Civil War. South Carolina was the first state to secede, and since Fort Sumter commanded Charleston Harbor, it instantly became the focus of national interest. The Secretary of War, Floyd, had dispersed the small army of the United States, and it was impossible to command the few hundred men necessary to adequately protect the forts. As matters in and about Charleston grew threatening, Major Anderson, who was in command of the town forts, Moultrie and Sumter, decided to abandon Moultrie and attempt to defend Sumter. The removal was successfully accomplished in the night, and when the fact was discovered, the South Carolinians were confused and angry. Buchanan had tried to help by sending supplies on the steamer Star of the West, but the South Carolinians had fired on the ship, and they were forced to abandon the attempt. Meanwhile, Lincoln held fast to the two promises of his inaugural. First, that he would hold the United States forts, and second, that he would not be the aggressor. Meanwhile, Major Anderson was barely holding on at Fort Sumter. He had a total of 128 men and little ammunition, and was almost out of supplies. All this while, the Southerners were busy preparing their forts, which were now better both in number and in warehousing supplies. General Beauregard was in command of the military forces. He sent to Major Anderson a summons to surrender. The latter replied that if he received from Washington no further direction, and if he was not given support by April 15th, he would surrender on honorable terms. On Friday, April 12th, at 3:30 in the afternoon, General Beauregard gave notice to Major Anderson that he would open fire on Fort Sumter in 1 hour. Promptly, at the minute the first gun was fired, the war had begun. The next day, the officers' quarters were set on fire. The troops attempted to hold on, but on Sunday, April 14th, the garrison saluted the flag as it was being lowered and then marched out, prisoners of war. Sumter had fallen. Beauregard was a military man. Lincoln was a statesman. The general got the fort. The president got nearly everything else. The war was on, and it had been begun by the South. The administration had not invaded or threatened invasion, but the South had fired on the flag. The effect of the fall of Sumter was staggering. In the South, it was hailed with delight, especially in Charleston. The effect of the North was quite different. There was a tremendous feeling of indignation against the people who had fired on the flag. At the date of the fall of Sumter, Lincoln had been in office less than 6 weeks. The fall of Sumter caused an outburst of patriotism throughout the entire North. Lincoln had prepared his call for 75,000 volunteer troops. Further, the 75,000 was about 5 times the number of soldiers then in the Army of the United States. Senator Douglas and President Lincoln had a private interview. Douglas came out of the meeting a war Democrat. He prepared a telegram which was published declaring that he would support the president and defend the Constitution. The call for volunteers was published on the morning of April 15th. Lincoln had asked for 75,000 volunteers to serve for 3 months. Virginia joined the Confederacy. Washington now had the enemy a close distance from the White House. The first major battle of the war was fought on July 21st, 1861, at Bull Run, approximately 25 miles from Washington. The battle was carefully planned, and except for delay in getting started, it was fought pretty much as planned. The Confederates were receiving reinforcements all day. The Union troops had been on their feet since 2 o'clock in the morning. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, these men were tired. The Union Army panicked, and a large number of men ran back to Washington. It was said that Washington was at the mercy of the Confederates. More than likely, the Confederates were in no position to chase after the Union troops. It was a hard battle on both sides. The Confederates reveled in their victory. Jefferson Davis wasted no time in telegraphing the results of the battle to the states of the Confederacy. Lincoln was greatly disappointed by the defeat. The short time as president had made Lincoln an old man. During these turbulent times, Lincoln went many nights without food or sleep. Harper's Monthly for July 1865 wrote the following description. Though the intellectual man had greatly grown, few persons would recognize the hearty, blithesome, genial Abraham Lincoln of earlier days. With his now stooping figure, dull eyes, careworn face, and languid frame, the old clear laugh never came back. The even temper was sometimes disturbed, and his natural charity for all was often turned into unwanted suspicion of the motives of men, whose selfishness caused him so much wear of mind. Up to this time, the Union troops were led by 75-year-old Winfield Scott. Lincoln believed that Scott was not aggressive enough in his leadership, and he was replaced by General George B. McClellan. He was slow and meticulous in training his men. Lincoln was losing his patience by the end of 1861. McClellan's men were not ready for battle. The following February, his two boys, Willie and Tad, were taken ill. Lincoln would sit up with the nurse at night, and during the day he would frequently slip away from meetings to visit the boys. Willie died on February 20th, and for several days before his death, he was delirious. His father was with him almost constantly. Lincoln and Mary were consumed with grief. Lincoln stayed in his room for days after his son's death, and Mary was devastated. She sank into a deep depression and could not be consoled. Lincoln did put aside his personal tragedy and once again became consumed by the ugliness of war. It was Lincoln's habit to let his generals do their work in their own ways, only insisting that they should accomplish visible and tangible results. This method he followed with McClellan, developing it with great patience under trying circumstances. As an organizer and drill master, McClellan was superb. In defense, he was a terrible fighter. A distinguished Confederate soldier said, "There was no Union general whom we so much dreaded as McClellan. He had, as we thought, no equal." At Yorktown, he faced the Confederate Magruder, who commanded 11,000. Of this number, 6,000 were spread along a line of 13 miles of defense across the peninsula, leaving 5,000 for battle. McClellan had 58,000 troops he prepared for defense, and when the engineering work was accomplished, he did an excellent job of defending his army. All the while, he was calling for reinforcements from Washington. At Antietam, he won a brilliant victory, but he failed to follow it up. Lincoln believed that McClellan had the opportunity to destroy the Confederate army and end the war. Lincoln believed that McClellan had not followed through. He was constantly calling for reinforcements for the battles he was directly involved in and understaffing the ranks of the other commanders. He continually showed his disdain for Lincoln. He would sit silent in the cabinet meetings, pretending to have secrets of great importance. Instead of calling on the president to report, he made it necessary for the president to call on him. At other times, he would keep the president waiting while he pretended to be busy with his staff. In the early part of the war, there were certain attempts at emancipation which Lincoln held in check because he believed it wasn't the right time. The problem was laid with the fact that if the Union was destroyed, it would be sudden death to the emancipation movement. The first part of 1862 was very difficult. Aside from his personal tragedy, the North had expected to march rapidly into Richmond. This had not been accomplished. Union troops had had defeats in battle, and two armies were encamped facing each other almost in sight of Washington. It wasn't until the 22nd of July that Lincoln presented the rough draft of the proclamation to his cabinet. The rest of the story is best told in Lincoln's own words. It had got to be midsummer, 1862. Things had gone on from bad to worse until I felt that we had reached the end of our rope on the plan of operations we had been pursuing. That we had about played our last card and must change our tactics or lose the game. I now determined upon the adoption of the emancipation policy, and without consultation or knowledge of the cabinet, I prepared the original draft of the proclamation, and after much anxious thought, called a cabinet meeting upon the subject. I said to the cabinet that I had resolved upon this step and had not called them together to ask their advice, but to lay the subject matter of a proclamation before them, suggestions as to which would be in order after they had heard. The members of the cabinet offered suggestions. Seward told Lincoln that the time was not right and that he was better off waiting until there was a Union victory. It was not until September 17th that the timing improved. The Confederate Army had crossed the Potomac with the intention of invading the North. They were met and completely defeated in the Battle of Antietam. Lincoln said of it, When Lee came over the river, I made a resolution that if McClellan drove him back, I would send the proclamation after him. The preliminary proclamation was dated September 22nd. The finalized version of the Emancipation Proclamation was read on January 1st, 1863, whereas on the 22nd day of September in the year of our Lord, 1862, a proclamation was issued by the President of the United States containing, among other things, the following, to wit, that on the first day of January, against the United States. Now therefore I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power in me, vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, in time of actual armed rebellion against the authority of and government of the United States, and as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, do on this first day of January, in the year of our Lord, 1863, and in accordance with my purpose so do, publicly proclaimed for the full period of 100 days from the day first above mentioned, order and designate as the states and parts of states, wherein the people thereof, respectively, are this day in rebellion against the United States. And by virtue of the power and for the purpose aforesaid, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and for parts of states are and henceforward shall be free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons. And I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence, unless, if necessary, in self-defense. And I recommend to them that in all cases, when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. And I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution, upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. The middle period of the war was gloomy and discouraging. There were no decisive victories gained by the Federal troops. Antietam had been won, but the fruits of that victory were lost. The Union Army was strong in numbers and equipment, but it lacked leadership. Lincoln held on to McClellan as long as it was possible. He never resented the personal discourtesies, but his persistent inactivity wore out the patience of the country and finally of the Army itself. Lincoln called upon other military men to serve. Hooker was considered too dictatorial by Lincoln, and he was dismissed. And then there was George C. Meade. It was only a few days after his appointment that the Battle of Gettysburg was fought, and it was a great victory. But here, as at Antietam, the triumph was bitterly marred by the disappointment that followed. Meade let the defeated army get away. It was again a golden opportunity to destroy Lee's army and end the war. Lincoln realized that the hero of Gettysburg was not the man destined to crush the rebellion. In the meantime, affairs were very dark for the administration, and up to the summer of 1863, it seemed to be growing darker. There had been some military victories in the West, but the West was so remote from the capital, especially as compared to the limited theater of war in Virginia, where the Confederate Army was almost within sight of the capital. The attention of the country lay between Washington and Richmond. In that region, nothing permanent or decisive had been accomplished in the period of more than 2 years. The mood of the country was polarized in regard to the emancipation of slaves, as we, the nation, could not agree on the signing of the Emancipation. Many people supported Lincoln, but there was a vast number of Northern Democrats who did not care about the emancipation of the slaves. Their concern was only with the preservation of the Union. In 1863, Democrats took on the position that the war must be stopped and the troops needed to be sent home. Lincoln was not going to change his position. He was determined to liberate all slaves. Both sides grieved for their losses. The total loss of killed, wounded, and missing was over 31,000 on the Confederate side, and on the Union side, about 23,000. The Confederates lost 17 generals, and the Federals 20. At the very time the Army of the Potomac was apparently doing nothing, there was a man in the West who was building up for himself a remarkable reputation. He was all the while winning victories, destroying armies, making advances. This was Ulysses S. Grant. He was a graduate of West Point and had served in the Mexican War and rose to captain. When the president called for the 75,000 men, Grant proceeded at once to make himself useful by drilling volunteer troops. His first service was in Missouri. When stationed at Cairo, he seized Paducah on his own. The move possibly saved Kentucky for the Union. He was then ordered to break up a Confederate force at Belmont, a few miles below Cairo. He started at once on his expedition, and though the enemy was largely reinforced before his arrival, he was victorious. Then came Forts Henry and Donelson. The victory at Fort Donelson was the greatest Union victory up to that time. When asked what terms he would allow, his reply was unconditional surrender. This became his nickname for the remainder of the war. Grant's important victories in the West came in rapid and brilliant succession. The Battle of Shiloh was fought on April of 1862. Vicksburg surrendered July 4th, 1863, and the Battle of Chattanooga took place in November of 1863. It was after the capture of Vicksburg that Grant realized that he was the man destined to end the war. After the Battle of Chattanooga, public opinion generally pointed to him as the general who was to lead our armies to ultimate victory. In February 1864, Congress passed an act creating the office of Lieutenant General. The President approved that act on Washington's birthday and nominated Grant for that office. The Senate confirmed the nomination on March 2nd, and Grant was ordered to report at Washington. Not everybody was in favor of the nomination. Grant was criticized for his drinking. His bouts with liquor were famous. The President was asked not to consider Grant, but Lincoln replied, "I like him. He fights." "But what about his drinking?" Lincoln replied, "Find out what he drinks and send a bottle to every one of my generals." On March 17th, General Grant assumed command of the armies of the United States with his headquarters in the field. Lincoln offered help and encouragement to all his generals, but there was a different relationship between the two men. They operated as a team. They were both driven for the same goal, an end to the war. Lincoln wrote Grant this letter of support on April 30th, 1864. Lieutenant General Grant, not expecting to see you again before the spring campaign opens, I wish to express in this way my entire satisfaction with what you have done up to this time, so far as I can understand it. The particulars of your plan I neither know nor seek to know. You are vigilant and self-reliant, and I am pleased with this. I wish not to obtrude any constraints or restraints upon you. While I am very anxious that any great disaster or capture of our men in great numbers shall be avoided, I know these points will be less likely to escape your attention than they would be mine. If there is anything wanting which is within my power to give, do not fail to let me know. And now, with a brave army and a just cause, may God sustain you. Yours very truly, A. Lincoln. On November 19th, 1863, Lincoln gave his now famous Gettysburg Address at the dedication of the Gettysburg Cemetery. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We are met to dedicate a portion of it as the final resting place of those who have given their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here